In today's video, I want to share with you my first impressions of owning this camera, the Red Komodo. For those of you that are new around here, my name's Riley, and I'm a documentary filmmaker who likes talking all things filmmaking and creativity. So if you're someone that's into making documentaries or making films with small crews, then you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and following along. All right, let's dive in. I've owned this camera for a little over 3 months and have been able to shoot a handful of jobs with it. I've shot run and gun stuff that is very much in line with kind of the documentary stuff that I've done a lot of in the past, where I've had to think really quickly on my feet and have a solid workflow on set to make sure that I'm not missing stuff. I've shot stuff that is definitely a little bit more kind of structured and narrative-like, with running anamorphic lenses and having some really creative lighting. And I've shot other stuff that just has kind of more of a moody narrative look. And so I feel like I've gotten a variety of experience with this camera in a pretty short amount of time. And so I feel like I'm pretty comfortable with it and have a decent sense of what it does and doesn't do well. And so I thought I'd share my first impressions with you. So I'll just briefly touch on image quality, because there's a good chance that you've already done a fair amount of research, but it goes without saying that the image quality on this camera really does live up to the hype. The red color science, the dynamic range on this camera, and the global shutter all make for an incredible image that is super easy to work with in post. And the fact that when you pair it with Red's R3D RAW codec, there just is a ton of flexibility. So one thing that stood out to me really quickly in a good way is just how good and efficient the post-production side of things is for the Red ecosystem. Now, there is a slight learning curve, especially if you've never worked with a RAW codec before, but I think that if you're familiar with ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW, I think a lot of the principles are going to translate and you're not going to have a super steep learning curve. But the really nice thing about this is just how flexible and how efficient it is on Red's codec, and as well if you download and use Red CineX Pro, which is a free standalone app that's kind of their color management app. It's not an editor per se, but you can do a lot with this program. And what's really nice is that if you load clips and load a project into, like for me, Final Cut, and then you open those same clips in Red CineX, what's nice is because it is raw footage that you're dealing with, when you make color changes inside of Red CineX, it's going to save those changes to a metadata file that you can reload inside of Final Cut. And then all of those changes that you've made, all of those things are going to port over into Final Cut or Premiere, because it's all non-destructive. And so it's all saving these changes to a metadata file that you can easily access and edit and load and reload. And so for me, I've found that it has just saved me a ton of time in post with a significantly better image. With Red's post-production pipeline and ecosystem is something that really has excited me and impressed me as well. One of the things that inevitably is going to come up in conversation around Red cameras is the cost-benefit analysis of owning this camera when it comes to the speed of editing a RAW codec, as well as managing the data of a high-resolution, RAW codec. And in my experience, I was pleasantly surprised, because I think that conversation is slightly overblown today. And the reason why I say that is because the 6K files in the LQ mode and the ELQ mode are actually roughly equivalent, or even slightly smaller than 4K at ProRes 422. And so if you use ProRes and you're comfortable with the file sizes on that, I think you're absolutely going to be fine. You're not going to have a significant amount more data that you're going to have to worry about archiving. And actually, the Red RAW codec is actually pretty efficient to edit with. I don't find it like significantly more taxing than my A7S III's footage, for example. Now, I don't think it's as fast as ProRes or ProRes RAW, but I think in general, the cost-benefit analysis side of things in today's age with the Apple Silicon chips, M1 and M2, I don't think that this is something that you need to stress about a significant amount. One other thing that stood out is just how modular this camera is. Now, it's certainly bigger than my mirrorless cameras, but this is like a really tiny, little cube-shaped camera, and it is super, super modular. And so that modularity is going to translate into flexibility on set. And so, depending on what kind of job you need this thing to do, I think that there is a solution for it when it comes to lensing, rigging, or just overall working with it. Now, there is a slight drawback, especially when you compare it to the Komodo X and kind of where some of the ports are placed. But I would say overall, this just is an incredibly flexible form factor that has been a joy to work with. I've been able to use these red BP batteries. I've been able to use V-mount batteries that power both the camera and my Ninja 5 monitor. I've been able to stick this thing on rails and have multiple microphones, a mini shotgun mic, and a wireless lav pack on it. And I've been able to kind of run around in different environments filming with it. The camera also has, because it's an RF mount, you can easily adapt EF lenses to it, for example. And so that opens up just kind of a world of possibilities, whether it's with, a speed booster and getting more of a full frame look, or putting a variable ND filter behind the lens and having some of the benefits that something like the FX6 or the C70 has with having that ND system kind of more or less built in. And so I feel like it is giving me more options to tap into as a filmmaker. I don't think it's necessarily making me a better filmmaker, but kind of having those tools available to me and not being sort of pigeonholed into something that is like purely a run and gun camera or purely like a narrative commercial camera is something that I think is really nice and it's just going to give me more options and flexibility as I progress and grow into this camera. Now, this camera is certainly not perfect, and I think that when you compare it to mirrorless cameras and just how good mirrorless cameras are these days, there are some definite trade-offs. Now, I think it's going to have a better image than my A7S III, but that is going to come at the cost of added expense. There just are going to be more parts that are needed with this camera, more accessories, and as well, you're going to have some cost in time on set because this thing takes a long time to boot up, and when you have to calibrate the sensor, that is going to be another 2 to 3 minutes out of your setup time that you're gonna have to factor in when working with this camera. So I've often had to leave this camera on in between takes and setups because it's not worth powering down and powering back up and losing that 30 to 60 seconds with that process and having to sort of worry about the sensor calibration and some of those things. And so I've had to invest in a V-mount battery system so that I can leave everything powered on and not have to unplug the SDI cable, power the monitor down, power the camera down, and then kind of do everything in reverse order. And so there is definitely a convenience to mirrorless cameras that I think is going to translate into being able to work faster and more efficiently. And last, with the business side of things, maybe this is the most important thing to look at. The Komodo has definitely been worth it because it's paying itself off. I've been able to rent it back to myself on a handful of projects, rent the camera out, and having owned it for 3 months, the camera is paying for itself and then some, which is really nice. And so I think even with the Komodo X coming out recently, within the first couple months of owning the camera, it's not something that I feel like really bummed about, because that camera is in such a different price bracket, with the body being almost double the price. It's not something that I would be, looking at if I was pulling the trigger on a Red today. This camera certainly is a little bit more modular and definitely has some, different intended uses. But for me, trying to get into the Red ecosystem and work with Red cameras more, I think the original Komodo definitely was the better business investment and the wiser choice. And yeah, overall have been super thrilled with it. Well, that is going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to leave a comment down below if you have any questions. I would love to hear from you. And as always, I will catch you guys in the next one.